Hello, and welcome to our podcast. It's 2020 Politics War Room with James Carville, and I'm Al Hunt. We are proud partners with the Sign Institute at American University. We have two great guests this week who we'll get to in just a minute. But first, please subscribe to 2020 Politics War Room on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcast. James, before we get to our first guest, you're doing fine out there, right?
As well as it can be expected under the circumstances.
That's all anybody can ask.
That's it.
Norman Pearlstine, for 4 decades, has been one of the most prominent journalists in America, an extraordinary career. He was managing editor of the Wall Street Journal and chief content officer for Bloomberg News, where I had the privilege and the joy of working for him. And for 11 years, he was the editor-in-chief of Time magazine. He's now the executive editor of the Los Angeles Times, where he and the owner, Patrick Soon-Shiong, are restoring that paper to its glory days. It won 2 Pulitzer Prizes this month. Norman, thank you for joining us. And tell us how you're directing coverage from your apartment, I gather. Los Angeles is a hotbed. The state has a mandated furlough requirement. It must really be challenging.
Well, it is. Our owner has a career of creating vaccines and using your own cells to fight illness, and he has been totally immersed in it. He came to visit with several of us on the 6th of March and just really was the first person to explain the science of the virus and why it is so communicable. And so as a consequence, we closed our building and went to lockdown on March 11th. And we've all been operating from outside the building, most of us from our residences, although there are obviously several journalists who are out on the street every day continuing to report the story. We'd never done anything like this where everything was done remotely. The Zoom video conference has replaced any other kind of conversation. And so far, we've been able to, I think, deliver a very high quality product, but every day is a strain because the level of risk and the level of uncertainty is unlike anything we've seen. And not only are there technical issues from working like this from outside the building, but as is certainly true of every other part of media, the advertising model has just blown up on us with this complete freeze on economic activity.
Oh, it must have. I just wish that I wish Donald Trump would have heeded Patrick back on March the 11th. We'd have been a lot better. But that was a great warning for you. When you do have reporters, though, who are still out reporting the story, Norman, how do you do that? Do you alternate them? Do you obviously want them to be safe?
Well, for one thing, we encourage people to work from home wherever possible, to work the phones. Most of us at some time in our life have had to rely on the telephone rather than in person. But obviously, our photographers and many of our reporters only get a story by talking to the people they want to write about. We try to make that voluntary. We do provide the kind of protection that you would expect people to have before they go out. And we really are just in frequent consultation. We are blessed with an editor from Metro, Shelby Grad, who is just one of those unique figures who really knows the story of Southern California unlike anyone I've ever run across. And be it an earthquake, a mudslide, fires, he has really got the drill down and has a staff of people who react to crisis and the unexpected in ways that amaze me every day. So that you mentioned the 2 Pulitzers. Actually, what I was just as proud of this year was that we were finalists in 5 categories, and 3 of them were coming out of the Metro staff.
Boy, that's great. I'm a digital subscriber and reader, and the stuff really has been good. And this terrible pandemic disproportionately hits those most vulnerable. And some of your really terrific stories have involved migrants, kids with COVID-19, and how they're being treated, Norman.
Well, that's been an important part of the story up till now, is just trying to quantify the virus and to chronicle the places where it has made a real impact on people's lives. We have a wonderful reporter in Seattle, Rich Reed, a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner with the Oregonian before he joined us, who was really one of the first to dig into the nursing home in Kirkland, where so many of the early fatalities were being recorded. And when you have journalists like that, then you're a happy beneficiary.
So I want to take the experience, and normally I've asked you first, but Albert, I certainly want you to chime in. Let's assume this goes the way that it kind of looks like it's going, where if you listen to what Dr. Fauci said, and literally every other public health expert, we'll try to open up some, we'll have a reoccurrence, and we'll just be in this kind of not very pleasant dance. And let's just assume that we have a vaccine by next March. Don't know it, but let's assume that. Norman, how do you think, given all your experience, American life or culture will change, if it will, as a result of all this? And then, Albert, you've written on it. I'm interested to see what you have to say.
Well, I think in the shortest term, meaning the last couple of months, I think, if anything, there's been a tendency, which has been exacerbated by the White House, to believe that this is an interruption from normality and that there's a quick return from it. As the reality kicks in, as we actually start learning to listen to people like Fauci, I think that you start seeing very significant changes in behavior, so that where the initial shock to the economy is the massive unemployment that has come from out of nowhere overnight, I think that just as there's the likelihood of a second wave of infection, there's a second wave of changes in the economy that will really be a reflection of consumer behavior. That obviously issues such as age and experience do affect how individuals react, but I think for a very large part of the population, being the first one to get on an airplane, to go to a baseball game, to want to go to a restaurant, is something that is going to come slowly. And so everything from, did I really need to buy that suit, to can I get a haircut every other month, I think will be a kind of unconscious but important reaction to this extraordinary change in circumstance. And just having to live with the anomalies and the uncertainty, I think will just make it that much tougher. A very good friend of mine out here runs a successful restaurant here in New York, and he says, under the rules of the SBA, I can't get that loan until I've reopened, and neither state will let me reopen. And that's the kind of thing that a society has to respond to with a much better safety net than anyone in Washington seems to think is important right now.
Yeah, just quickly, I agree. For those who expect a quick bounce back, the Congressional Budget Office forecasts unemployment will average 10.1% next year, and that's assuming that we make progress. So this is going to go on for a while. James, go ahead.
So you spent time, Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg. Now you're in Los Angeles. Is the kind of New York centric, Washington centric view of the world, when people say that in other parts of the country, is there some legitimacy to that?
Well, there is, and that's with the acknowledgement that there is a part of uh, California that is, very much in sync with a lot of the East Coast biases and so forth. But I think there are differences, and we've tried to, um, if you will, identify and articulate them and explaining how we are trying to revive the Los Angeles Times. I think there's a very big difference when you think about the Pacific Century and the role that Los Angeles would play in it, as opposed to, say, an Atlantic century or an American century in the mind of Henry Luce of the 1940s, which was very much about focusing on Europe. If the Washington Post start, its day by saying democracy dies in darkness, I think that when you're in Los Angeles, your instinct, being a part of the creative capital of the country, is that the future is now. And I think you see that in the major corporations of California. You see it in certainly the individuals and the smaller companies and the huge immigrant populations that so distinguish us from a part of the country where, if you will, the immigrant populations are now in their fourth generation.
So a big part of, I'll say, conservative or right wing, fill in the blank, is California is a place that is just rotting. There's poo-poo on the streets everywhere. It's just overrun with immigrants. Everybody is leaving California and moving to Texas. That doesn't seem to comport with what you think the reality of modern California is.
Well, I think it's both. And, but when you're a state with 40 million people and GDP equal to that of the fifth largest country in the world in terms of economies, you have a fair amount of diversity and variety. Even though Hillary Clinton uh, beat Donald Trump by 25 percentage points in California, we should not lose sight of the fact that more people voted for Donald Trump in California than any other state. So it's if you're in Los Angeles, which is certainly a progressive city and a progressive state, you may lose sight of the diversity of California itself. There is no doubt that it is a state where regulation and government involvement is a part of our culture. And sometimes, last year the legislature passed 1,000 new bills, and I've yet to find a federal agency that doesn't have a counterpart in Sacramento. But at the same time, it's a tremendous magnet for talent. It's a draw for people who believe in the future. We do a good job on accountability journalism, but we actually could be much better if we also wrote about innovation and inspiration the same way.
Norman, you mentioned the Pacific Rim a moment ago. You spent a lot of time in Asia, going back to your Wall Street Journal days. Spent a lot of time in China, which is now Trump's villain, the culprit responsible for this whole raging pandemic and deaths. Give us your sense of how China is going to play out in this scenario.
Well, first of all, I think you point the finger on in terms of this election. I think that if Trump is successful in, reinventing prosperity is just around the corner. Trust me, 2021 is going to be unlike anything we've ever seen. And he can get some traction with that kind of misdirection, then perhaps the China card is played a little less aggressively. But if you assume that going into the fall, his base is smaller, the concerns about the economy are greater, and you realize that his whole playbook is really based on, three things: what he calls truthful hyperbole, overnight ratings, and finding someone else to hold responsible for anything that doesn't work. That inevitably takes you to more tensions between China and the U.S. The one weakness in that is that there's actually bipartisan support for bashing China, and some of it is certainly justified. It's a very different society, a very different economy. It does not have the kind of respect for rule of law, for human rights, for treatment of the individual, or for a kind of transparency in government, which we don't always get, but which we think we're entitled to. Having said that, the interrelationships that have been built up over the last uh, 4 decades or so are such that we have to be careful that the party that is most damaged by escalating those tensions isn't the United States. I mean, just to look at the virus itself and how complicated it is, having started in China, and the kind of misinformation and confusion that can be sown about the source of the virus and so forth, we do have to keep in mind that China manufactures almost all of the antibiotics that we use in the United States. China controls, if you will, the population of pigs that are most in need for blood thinner. I could go through an extraordinary list of the exports from the Farm Belt to China, the imports that make so much of our high-tech work are part of those kinds of relationships. And when you decide that you can live without that, or that there's too much of a national security risk from having that kind of dependence, there aren't easy options that replace it overnight. And in many ways, I think the biggest fear is a nationalist China that is of a size and strength that says it doesn't need us as much as we are saying we don't need it.
Well, yeah, I get the impression, as I think you know, I have a first cousin who's lived over there for in Southeast Asia for 50 years, and he said if you talk to most of the people I do business with, he hadn't traveled the last 2 months. He said now in the last year or so, they see China as more the future. They used to always try to play off the Americans and the Chinese. He said now they're tilting more to the Chinese just out of real politics, if you will.
Well, and oddly, because their foreign policy is much more mercantilist than ours is, if you will. There's not so much ideology as there is, um, ways in which we can expand China, but it's not. It's very different, if you will, from, say, the territorial ambitions that Russia displays in Ukraine, or our own sense of what foreign policy should be responsible for.
So, Norman, maybe my history is a little flawed, but at the end of the last century, at the beginning of this century, we said, well, if we engage China, they'll get the sweet nectar of freedom and they'll expand rights and everything else.
That was certainly an aspiration, and
Right.
that you can point to places where the Chinese would say things that could be interpreted that way, but you're talking really about a very old authoritarian culture. And I think that, if you will, those kinds of aspirations for China will take longer than any of us would expect or necessarily like. But even in this period, with the outbreak of the virus in Wuhan, if the people who were studying the social media in China were clearly seeing levels of unhappiness, dissent, disgust with government that you could not have imagined even a decade ago. And while that's not growing out of some fierce commitment to human rights, nonetheless, the consequence of individuals knowing what goes on in the rest of the world and not thinking that the China model is the only model has risks for every government. But in the short term, I think the response from China to the kind of pressure coming from the White House, and the response that we should be most concerned about, is going to be one of espousing a greater degree of nationalism rather than, if you will, disgust with and desire to change its own government.
Wow. So, but I guess what I'm really was driving at is that it seemed to me that people around the Pacific Rim kind of understood this, and they did this TPP, which looked like at the time a pretty good idea to deal with Chinese mercantilism, as you call it.
That's correct. TPP was a deal we did with 19 countries, very much with that in mind. But if, as you'll recall, in Philadelphia in 2016, the entire Bernie contingent of the party had signs that only had one thing on it: no TPP.
Right. And of course, it got like, it was help negotiate it, right?
Right. And who then walked away from it.
On the whole, it was a massively smart thing to come up with and a massively stupid thing to not implement. I mean, we had everybody was on the, as I understand it, all of the Vietnamese and the Australians and the New Zealand and the Koreans and the Japanese and the Thais and the whatever. But we're going to all be part of this trading bloc deal with China, which is a threat, as Madeline Albright points out. It's an adversary. We had a plan to deal with an adversary, and we stupidly just shit-canned the whole thing, which is dumb.
Yes, I think that there was no doubt that, our own nationalist instincts were on the rise at that point, and there are reasons for that go to broader issues in our own society, such as income inequality and education inequality. And again, I think it is always easier to point the finger away from the problem if you have some responsibility for creating the problem. But I agree with you completely, James.
Yeah, I just think it's so that there was actually a clever way that a lot of people came together to deal with what is an issue, and that's their economic aggressiveness on every level.
That's right. I mean, but it's one of those things where there's no doubt that for many years, and a part of national policy in China was theft of intellectual property. It's not the first country that was true of. We accused the Japanese in the 70s, the Koreans in the 80s, but they were viewed as allies in ways that China was not. But we are now at a stage where there are significant technologies being developed outside the United States. We are not the only country, that is capable of innovation. And so that's why, if nothing else, we should be trying to figure out how to make better use of its technology, just as they did so well with ours.
Norman, before we let you go, let me just, one or two very, very quick questions. You mentioned earlier, what a tough environment this was for a major newspaper. And newspapers with an eroding business model have gone through hell in the last couple of decades. With this pandemic, is it going to be the likely death knell for a lot of papers?
Well, I think it will accelerate trends that have been in place all along. In our case, having been part of the Tribune Company from the time that Times Mere sold the LA Times in 2000 until 2018, we lost out on a decade of investment in technology, in the ability to create new products for new audiences on new platforms. And so we were more print-centric and more reliant on print than I think many publications were as recently as 2 years ago. And trying to catch up in this kind of economic environment is very tough. But I think the Los Angeles Times itself actually is in a good position when markets come back. We are moving aggressively in these areas. But when you think about newspapers across the state, whether it's the McClatchy Group, which, as you know, bought Knight Ridder in the middle of the last decade, now in having certain to file for bankruptcy, or I guess has already begun that process. When you look at Alden Capital and its ownership of publications like the San Jose Mercury, which has a tenth the staff it had 20 years ago, the outlook for the kind of journalism that people have been accustomed to for a very long time, I think, is difficult. And where that's most reflected is in Sacramento, a place that not many people cover very aggressively, but which, as you pointed out earlier, with regard to the questions of people debating whether they want to stay and do business here or not, Sacramento is hugely important. But the ability to cover the State House in a way that makes it relevant to your own community is something that gets harder to do every day across the state.
Well, one advantage you have, Norman, is you have an owner who is smart, has deep pockets, and has a commitment, and also has a great editor. What does Patrick now say about this pandemic?
Patrick considers it, well, I have to be careful answering that, because for the last month he has been locked down himself, but where he's locked down is in his lab, where he's been working on trying to not only create a workable vaccine, but the manufacturing capability to produce billions of doses. So all I can say about it is that from the beginning, he thought it was far more serious than a lot of people who thought it was just a kind of bad case of the flu. Part of it is that he was quite familiar with what was required to treat HIV/AIDS, to treat SARS and MERS. And so when he looks at these kinds of things, he feels that anything short of total social distancing, anything short of a vaccine, will not necessarily address the ways a fast-moving virus capable of mutating the way this one does, can affect communities.
Wow. Norman, we know you have to get back to putting out a newspaper. We can't thank you enough.
Well, I look forward to speaking with both of you anytime, and when circumstances permit, come out and see us.
We will do that. And James, I've always said that wherever I am, wherever he is, Norman will always be my editor for life. And I cannot thank you enough. And be safe, and we'll talk soon.
You bet. Thank you, Norman. Next time I see you, be at Dan Tanner's. We'll have some drinks.
Okay, and we'll talk soon. Thanks again, guys.
Wow, boy, he's one of the most interesting people I've ever known in my life. And what can you imagine over the last 40 years, all those incredible top jobs he's held, and he's still going strong.
God, it's just so much fun to just sit here in the middle of this and between noon and 1 o'clock and just have a conversation.
Right.
With somebody with that kind of insight and experience. I mean, you can meet a lot of smart people and you meet a lot of experienced people, but I don't know if anybody is a combination, seen more, covered more, been more places, and been as insightful as Norman Pearlstine is, and I mean that.
No,
I really mean that.
No, I agree. All right, Jung Pak is a senior fellow for East Asia Policy Studies. Earlier, she was a senior North Korean analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency. She has written a compelling new book on the North Korean dictator becoming Kim Jong-un, which the LA Times, Norman Pearlstine's paper, just gave a great review. No one is more knowledgeable about that nuclear-armed rogue state than Dr. Pak, and we are delighted you can join us.
Thank you so much, Al. Thank you, James, for having me on.
This is a terrific book. Let me tell you, I came away, and as you know, James and I are both political hacks, but I love reading it. I came away with this impression that this is an evil regime. Kim Jong-un is every bit as brutal, if not more so, than his grandfather and father, but he is one shrewd dude. This is no dummy.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to do. And if you just look at the title, the cover art of the book, it's an actual picture of him. And we are looking from above. It's kind of a metaphor for the CIA or the CCTV or the fact that we are watching him. And he's casting this shadow as he walks forward. We don't know where he's moving. We can't see his full face. And I love the cover art because it conveys so much of that uncertainty, but it also presents him as a multi-dimensional figure, which is exactly what I wanted to do with this biography.
Yeah, he played Trump pretty well during these tense times of the last couple of years, didn't he?
Well, I'd say that he probably wasn't, he probably was surprised, like all of us were, when President Trump said in March of 2018 that he would be willing to meet with Kim. And this is something that no sitting US president has ever done. And North Korea was quiet for the following month. I think they were trying to figure out what to make of this thing that fell on their laps. And so, when we look back on the past, a little over 2 years, we're still at that status quo where North Korea hasn't given up any of its nuclear weapons. They've continued to develop their capabilities and demonstrate them. Their human rights violations are still on course, and they've shut the door on dialogue. So we haven't moved the needle very much, if at all, on our goals of North Korea denuclearization.
How do you think Kim today, sitting over there, how do you think he views the situation? Their economy is as awful as ever. He still has his nukes. He went through that time of 2017 where he and Trump were threatening each other with destruction. And then you had the 2018 summit meetings. How do you think Kim sizes things up right now?
I would say that, he would look back on the past 2.5, 3 years, and he'd say that he's done a lot. He's accomplished a lot. He has faced down the U.S. president, as you mentioned, the fire, fury, and locked and loaded of 2017, which was really tense, and people thought that we were headed toward a war by miscalculation, pretty much. And despite having conducted 3 intercontinental ballistic missile tests and a huge nuclear test in 2017, these would have been red lines, a year ago, 2 years ago, before it actually happened in 2017. But he's done those things. He has shown those capabilities. And yet what he got in response was a summit, many summits with the U.S. president, the Chinese leader, as well as the South Korean president. And he has suffered few, if any, repercussions for his actions, which were highly, highly provocative.
So if generally the American public sees this guy, and he's like almost a cartoon character to people. His hair is funny, looks funny, etc. And, they love to make fun of him on the Daily Show, of the late night TV. And people look at North Korea as this kind of half-starving, people that have been subjugated to some horrible life, which I'm sure is part true. But one, he strikes me, and particularly after reading your book, is anything but a cartoon character. And two, whatever issues that North Korea has, and I would defer to you, they're multitudinous, they have some talented people there. I mean, they can make rockets and bombs. I know they can counterfeit money. I mean, there's a technical class in that country that's not on the level of a third world country at all. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, James, that's exactly right. That when the general public, or even I would say even government officials, talk about Kim Jong-un, they think of him or see him or even describe him as this cartoon character. And in many ways, Kim Jong-un and North Korea does invite that kind of caricature. They have this very blustery language, the socialist architecture and the out of this world kind of socialist realist art. Their blustery language, the way Kim looks, all of that looks, and the parades in which all of these soldiers are marching in complete unison. it presents this, it's North Korea is ripe for caricature. And I think, and I argue in the book that that would be a very dangerous thing to do, to see this country with nuclear arms as a cartoon character that can be swiped away or laughed away, but that in fact that is not the case. And James, you're absolutely right that that North Korea has has a very capable expert class. And it's amazing, right, how if you have the political will and the resources to pour into something, how you can develop these very advanced, sophisticated weapons. And I'm not just talking about the nuclear weapons program. I'm talking about the cyber capabilities that North Korea has developed over the years under Kim Jong-un.
It strikes me, for whatever historical reason, that the Korean Peninsula has really got a lot of talented people. I mean, there's a lot of talented places in the world, and I mean, North Korea has been really, really subjugated, and I can't imagine how much talent it'd have if it was allowed to flourish in the way that South Korea has. But that's a very interesting part of the world, and I think you've really done a lot to bring it to people, the reality of what they're faced with.
Yeah, and South Korea is is one of the top economies, and we've seen what they've done with the coronavirus. They're touted as the success story, the model of how a country should deal with a pandemic. And the peninsula has been divided for 70 years. And, and that's something that, North Korea sees this. The Kim dynasty sees what South Korea has been able to do. South Korea has vaulted past North Korea in the military realm, in the economic and the political, all of the successes that South Korea has. And one of the key reasons for North Korea's self-isolation is that they see their existential enemy is just 35 miles away. And that, if there was any kind of reunification, that they would be swallowed up whole by the entrepreneurial expertise, the scientific expertise, the military, the governance expertise of South Korea. And so when we look at North Korea, I think we have to understand that North Korea isn't just afraid of us, but they're also afraid of being gobbled up by South Korea. And so, I don't see inter-Korean engagement or economic projects having the impact or the effect that I think the South Korean government thinks that it will have.
Jung, one of the really fascinating points you make in the book, and alarming, is that Donald Trump talks about condos on the beaches and building some kind of economic powerhouse in North Korea. But Kim doesn't really want that. He doesn't even want peace because that really threatens his very existence.
Yeah, Al. So I think what I tried to incorporate into the book is my super duper fancy CIA analyst training. How to do structured analysis, how to figure out if you are thinking about something the wrong way, or how to take into account various perspectives. And thinking about things in terms of scenarios. And when we look at Kim and when we look at how to incentivize North Korea, we think of it in terms of our language, which is, well, of course, everybody wants to be rich. Well, of course, everybody wants a beachfront condo. Well, of course, everybody wants American entrepreneurs, pouring foreign assistance and development money into the country. But in fact, Kim perceives that as a threat to his regime. It's a threat to his control. And so what I wrote in the book was that President Trump, is prone, like many people, prone to think in terms of how we would behave or what we are used to. And so Trump has been a real estate person in New York, a businessman. And my sense was that he approached Kim in a way that a New York City businessman would approach a contractor or potential business partner, or or some sort of person whom he's doing business with in New York. But Kim has different views. He has different drivers. He's not driven by money. He has it. We don't know how much millions or billions of money that he has stashed away in his reserves. But he has the wealth. What he wants is for people to be able to keep his nuclear weapons, be able to use them to threaten his neighbors in the U.S., but also to get the sanctions lifted so that he can develop the economy the way he wants to develop the economy in North Korea.
So let's just say it's a hypothetical. Joe Biden is elected president of the United States. He's got 100 things he's dealing with. North Korea fires a missile, comes within 20 miles of Guam. And it said, okay, we're going to talk to this guy. And they call you, and the Secretary of State says, get on Air Force One. We're going to Bangkok or Hanoi or wherever. And he's getting ready to go in a meeting. And he says, what are the three things? Remind me of the three things that I have to know and keep in mind during this meeting. What would you tell now President Biden?
So if the president was going in to see Kim Jong-un, you're saying?
Right. And you're part of and he looks at you right before he's going in. It's just his translator, Kim Jong-un, and their translator. What are the three things you want him to keep in mind during this whole meeting?
I would say that one, he's going to bluster and talk tough, or at least demonstrate strength, because that's his default. And that's what we've seen so far of Kim Jong-un, that he absolutely needs to show confidence, even though he might not have confidence. And if you look at some of the other accounts of negotiations with North Korea, they respond better to tough by the U.S. versus concessionary. And so I would say go in tough. But keep the dialogue lines open, but don't go in with the sense that you have to concede as a baseline. In fact, it should be the opposite. Second, I would say that there is an absolute necessity to keep tensions under control, which is that you have thousands of pieces of artillery in North Korea that are pointed directly at Seoul, which in its metropolitan area has 25 million people. And any kind of artillery attack against Seoul would decimate the population. 300,000, according to the Congressional Research Service, or up to 1 million. And who knows what would happen if the North Koreans decided to unleash its substantial cache of chemical and biological weapons. So I would say that you want to keep tensions at bay and to avoid a happy trigger finger by North Korea, because we would have potentially millions of lives at stake in South Korea. And third, I would say, following that second point, would be to try to leverage that point. Don't let a crisis go to waste, right? To try to use that as an opportunity to talk tough and to have a stern hand on the crisis, but also to use that as an opportunity to demand things of him, whether it's continued dialogue, military tension reductions, and how this would be, and how the U.S. can leverage this to argue with Beijing, North Korea's closest political and economic partner, that Beijing has to step in. So I think those are the three things I would say. Don't come in tough, come in swinging. Second, remember that escalating tensions would put millions of lives at stake on the Korean Peninsula as well as in the region. And third, don't let a crisis go to waste, and use that as an opportunity to demand things of North Korea, including dialogue or standing down of its military capabilities, as well as to try to get Beijing on board with our tough policies.
Well, if this happens, I hope then President Biden does take you with him. He couldn't do better. We really appreciate your time. I'm going to ask you the toughest question that you have been asked during this whole time, Jung, and that is, which is more difficult, trying to analyze an isolated, secretive place like North Korea, or sheltering at home during a pandemic with a 6 and 7-year-old?
Yeah, I'm trying to do both. I'm not sure if I'm meeting success at either.
Well, you're terrific to take time out to be with us. It is really a terrific book, Becoming Kim Jong-un, by the best when it comes to understanding this very elusive and secretive place. Jung, thank you so much for being with us, and stay safe.
Thank you, man. Very, very, very impressive. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, James Carville.
Yes, sir.
We have a few minutes left. You wrote a very provocative column this week that what Joe Biden should do right now, more importantly than picking a running mate or anything else, is that he should name someone as his attorney general. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I think that given what we see in the country right now, I think that, of course, we got the gazillion problems that we got to deal with, climate deficit, COVID, political divisions, you name it. But I think the biggest problem we have is I think what he can do is make a real statement that the United States is a nation of laws. And there's one name that if he says is going to be my attorney general, in my opinion, would pretty much seal the deal, and that's Elizabeth Warren. I mean, she has such a brand, and such a brand as a kind of a really smart, middle-class oriented person who has the competence, ability, and a kind of courage to do what we have to do to make this a nation of laws, to investigate this criminality wherever it is, and give us confidence that we're going to be that kind of country. And I just think no other name comes even close to hers, is making that statement as simply and as definitively as Joe Biden would make it if she said, this is going to be my attorney general. I think the next attorney general is the most important selection that he's going to have to make. I really do.
Well, I agree with that. This is one of our rare disagreements, at least on the timing. If you could persuade me this would really alter the election outcome, I'd probably sign on. But I think people vote on fundamentals of candidates, a campaign. I'm afraid to be seen as more of a gimmick. I think she'd be a good attorney general. I'm not sure if that's her forte. But most of all, James, what would worry me was it is not a far-fetched scenario to say the Democrats pick up 4 Republican-held Senate seats and they lose 1. That makes a 50-50 Senate. And if Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker, who's a Republican, then gets to replace Senator Warren for 4 to 5 months, which he'd pick a Republican, that would be a disaster for the first 100 days of the Biden administration. It's a risk. It's too big to take. And if you do have a landslide, as you think is possible, and you win 7 or 8 Senate seats, appoint her then.
Well, I'll tell you what you can do. She can resign the seat in August, and he'd have to have an election in January. So you would be, I guess maybe he'd point out, not much going to happen between August and Election Day. And no one looks at her and says this is a gimmick. I mean, she's anything other than a gimmick. I mean, people, you like her, love her, don't like her, detest her. You know exactly who she is. And you just very seldom get a chance in terms of a personnel decision to make that case. And, and she can defend, she'd be a very good advocate for the campaign and for Vice President Biden and whoever he picks as lieutenant governor. And, we got this thing with Senator Markey and Joe Kennedy, and I suspect that whoever loses that primary would be a pretty formidable candidate in a January election. I mean, but there's some risk in everything. I just think the value here far exceeds any possible risk. And I wouldn't do it in a lot of things. Everybody's always said, tease your cabinet out, and for good reason, people haven't done it. But this is a name that just strikes me as just bringing so much into the campaign that it's a risk worth taking.
Well, I don't know if it'll happen. If it does, I sure hope you're right. Just mark me down as skeptical, but we will see.
I hope we don't get Martha Coakley to run for the seat.
Oh my God! Let me ask you that. Well, see, I'm still burned by what happened with Senator Kennedy.
I understand. I understand. But there are ways that you can minimize this. Everything has risk, but there are things you can do, and Massachusetts can do without a senator between August and January.
Could be some big votes on judges and other things in October, and maybe even a lame duck session. But we'll see how it plays out. Let me ask you this: we've been talking about, we've been watching, reading, everything. You're out in the Shenandoah. What's cooking, literally?
So I'm assuming people that watch this, I'm going to give you a recipe.
Yep.
All right. Tuna fish, tuna salad. Everybody likes tuna salad. All right. This is what you're going to do. You're going to get 4 cans of Wild Planet tuna. Only Wild Planet. No other brand comes even close. If you listen to Wild Planet, we'll take you as a sponsor. And the next thing you're going to do is you're going to wash your hands like you just changed 2 diapers. Then you're going to take that tuna with your hands, with your really clean hands, and just massage it till you get it as close to powder as you can get it. Then you squeeze a lot of lemon juice. How much? I don't know. Shit, a big whole lemon, a lot of lemon juice, and crank out a lot of Lee and Perrins. I'd say like 8 shakes. And then cover it with black pepper. Then mix that. That's going to take all the fishy stuff out. It's going to give you real umami. It's going to give you depth and taste. Then put more finely diced celery and red onion than you think you need. Just a lot of it because it's going to give it crunch. Then put 3 heaping tablespoons of mayo, 1 heaping tablespoon of deli mustard. Gluten is fine, doesn't matter. I use Zatarain's because it's Creole mustard. And mix it together. Look at the constituency. What you want to do is put little enough where you want to add more mayo and mustard. You can't take away what's already in there. Then when you get it right to the right constituency, take some finely chopped chives, put it on the top, serve that, you're going to be a popular person. I promise you. And it's easy to do, and it never fails. Tuna fish a la Carvel.
I have never really been around a stove indoors. I'm okay outdoors, but not indoors, so I can't begin to tell a comparable story. The only thing I can say is, for those of you out there with grandchildren who you can't see and you're worried about, we've come up with a new way. Every weekend, our daughter brings a 2.5-year-old over. We go out in the parking lot. She gets one of those clear cellophane tarps to put over him. He's in a stroller. He doesn't like that much, but she makes sure he can't get it off. And we spend an hour. You got to adjust. You got to adapt. And if you're a grandparent, start with James's tuna fish, and then go to the cellophane cover with a grandchild.
Right. Yeah, you know what? We got to our sights have to be lowered a little bit doing this thing. It's not like I'm going to get Clancy seafood gumbo here, you know.
Lord knows what we're going to come up with next week, but boy, I'll tell you, we do awful well to come close to the kind of guests we had this week.
Oh, it was good, interesting, fascinating. What a way to spend an hour.
Yeah, and you learn a lot, and it's fun too. So, James, I want you to be safe this week. And I again thank our partners at the Sign Institute at AU, and I thank all of you for listening to 2020 Politics War Room. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at Politics War Room. And thank you for subscribing to the show. And if you leave us a 5-star review, we really wouldn't mind that. We will be most grateful. And for James Carville, I'm Al Hunt. We'll talk to you next week, and please continue to stay safe out there.